You know, something interesting I noticed while I was rewatching this movie is the fact that almost all the characters have three-letter nicknames. Like there's Max, Eli, Kia, Evie, and a lot of people would say, well, you know, Daria is like the fifth central character and her name has five letters, but they also refer to her as just Dar a couple of times in the movie, D-A-R. And whenever she introduces one of her new girlfriends, they always have a shortened nickname that's just three letters. It's, uh, it's just it's interesting. I don't know what to make of it. Like, is that a lesbian thing? Is that a decision that they made for the movie? I mean, I could just be overthinking it. It could just be that they wanted to give the characters simple names to remember, but I don't know. It's something interesting I noticed. So, yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Boy, has it been a while. I've taken a pretty long hiatus from YouTube, and really, to come back, I felt like I just needed a film to entice me, something to draw me in and tempt me. And what could possibly be more enticing than lesbian films from the mid-90s? So this week, to ease my way back into YouTube, as well as celebrate Pride Month before it ends, I figured it'd be fun to talk about Go Fish from 1994. And before anyone asks, the title Go Fish has nothing to do with the VJ joke. It's called that because in the card game Go Fish, you make a pair. And this movie's about making a pair as in a couple. It's that simple. Don't know how a lot of people don't get that. Anyway, Go Fish is the feature debut for director and co-writer Rose Troche, as well as co-writer and star Guinevere Turner. While dating in the early 90s, both women came up with the idea to make a movie that represented the authentic lesbian experience. And they did this as a response to what they saw as a lack of proper, realistic lesbian representation in the mainstream. So, over the course of 2 years, these women teamed up with various members of the queer community in Chicago, which is where they lived, and through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, went from making a small, experimental short film to a full-blown romantic feature. After the film was completed, Troche and Turner ended up getting it distributed with the help of John Pearson, author of the book Spike, Mike's, Slackers, and Dykes. And Go Fish ended up getting pushed through Sundance, where it became one of the most beloved independent features of 1994. I stress one of the most beloved. Because, coincidentally, the same year Go Fish came out, a few months later, Clerks was released, which was the first film from pop culture icon Kevin Smith. Now, as I've mentioned many other times before, Clerks made massive waves in the indie scene when it came out. It was basically the darling of Sundance that year, and it single-handedly kickstarted the career of Kevin Smith, which is still continuing today. But while I've talked about both Clerks and Kevin Smith ad nauseum in various other videos, something I've only mentioned in passing is the relationship that Clerks has with Go Fish. The two films share a very interesting relationship that stem from their similarities with each other. I mean, obviously you have the surface level stuff, which is par for the course with most indie films, the fact that the movies were shot on ultra low budgets, like under 30 grand each, the fact that both films have very poignant writing, and the fact that both films use non-professional actors. But beyond those points, Go Fish and Clerks also share a lot of similarities in their underlying plot and aesthetic. For one thing, both movies embrace a somewhat laid-back slacker vibe. Both films revolve around losers in their 20s with romantic issues. But probably the most immediate similarity you could point out with both movies is the fact that they're both shot in black and white, which was uncommon at the time. I mean, honestly, how many black and white comedies can you think of that came out in 1994? You know, aside from Tim Burton's Ed Wood. But seriously, the similarities between these films are very interesting to say the least. And the relationship between these movies is so close that I would go as far as saying that Go Fish and Clerks are essentially sister films. They go together, they complement each other while also contrasting at the same time, almost like they're cut from the same cloth. And the filmmakers themselves felt the same way. as both Rose Troche and Guinevere Turner became very close friends with Kevin Smith and his producing partner Scott Mosier at Sundance in '94. And Smith specifically liked Turner so much that he not only gave her cameos in 2 of his following films, being Chasing Amy and Dogma respectively, but he also based 2 of his characters on her. The characters of Gwen Turner from Mallrats and Alyssa Jones from Chasing Amy are both based on Guinevere Turner. And coincidentally, both characters are played by the same woman, Joey Lauren Adams. Of course, with the character of Alyssa Jones, she's more of like a blend between Turner and Adams. I think Guinevere Turner herself describes the character of Alyssa Jones as sort of a Frankendyke. But yeah, suffice to say, these movies and these filmmakers are linked. They influenced each other in different ways. I mean, Kevin Smith's 3rd film, Chasing Amy, is heavily inspired by Go Fish. And they even reference Clerks in both of the commentary tracks available on this Blu-ray. And for God's sake, the reason I even know about this film to begin with is because I'm a big fan of Kevin Smith. 2 years ago, I went to a screening of the documentary Chasing Amy, which is about the LGBT community's relationship with the movie Chasing Amy. And they reference Go Fish in this documentary, and Guinevere Turner is even interviewed in the documentary, once again hammering home the relationship between these filmmakers. However, while the relationship between these movies and filmmakers is innately interesting, the thing that I find even more interesting is the fact that I only know about the existence of Go Fish because of my interest in Kevin Smith. Which I think communicates a rather disappointing reality about this movie, being the fact that Go Fish is not particularly well known by itself. Like, obviously there's nothing wrong with a movie being obscure, that's the whole point of my channel, to highlight obscure movies. But it is a little disappointing, the fact that despite how influential this film is, that it's not better known in the cultural zeitgeist. Especially when you compare Go Fish to its contemporaries. I mean, as mentioned, Kevin Smith's career skyrocketed after Clerks, and he was able to literally construct an entire cinematic universe around one movie. Meanwhile, you look at Rose Troche and Guinevere Turner, while they've certainly had success working on things over time, things like The L Word or American Psycho, they just have not garnered the same level of notoriety and success as Kevin Smith. And a lot of people would say that's not particularly fair to compare the career paths of Smith versus Troche and Turner, because as we all know, queer films are inherently more niche, catering to a smaller audience. Meanwhile, Kevin Smith essentially built his entire brand off of appealing to Gen X slackers and nerds living at home with disposable income. So of course he got more people to see his movies. But even if you compare Go Fish to other films in this wave of new queer cinema, it's still obscure compared to those movies. Like, whenever you're having broader discussions of queer cinema, and more specifically lesbian films from this era, people are more likely to bring up movies like The Watermelon Woman or But I'm a Cheerleader. And that's ironic, because both of those movies were directly inspired by Go Fish. I mean, for God's sake, Guinevere Turner appears in The Watermelon Woman. And so does V.S. Brody, her co-star in Go Fish. But yeah, obviously while Go Fish has its fans, it's just not as well known as other films that exist around it. Which is kind of a shame when you think about the fact that this movie is broadly considered to be one of the four sisters of new queer cinema. So I figured I should do my part and give this movie the highlight that it deserves. So with all that out of the way, you might be asking yourself, what actually happens in Go Fish? Well, Go Fish has a remarkably simple plot, as the movie is basically a rom-com. The main character of Go Fish is a single young woman named Max, played by Guinevere Turner, who has not gotten laid in 10 months. She's frustrated emotionally and clearly sexually, and all she wants is to be in a relationship. So she begs her roommate Kia to set her up with somebody. That somebody being Eli, played by V.S. Brody. Eli is a much shyer woman than Max, but she's also much more mature than Max, as when Max is first given the notion of going out with Eli, she just goes on to say that Eli has terrible fashion sense and is basically ugly. Like, Max just straight up says Eli is ugly. She does the whole, like, childhood rhyme of UGLY, you don't got no alibi, which really just goes on to highlight, like, how immature Max is as a character, and how shallow she is as well. Of course, Max's reluctance is eventually outweighed by her loneliness, and she chooses to go on one date with Eli. There's some clashing here and there, some disagreements, some awkwardness, but there's chemistry between the two women, and things are going pretty well until Max discovers that Eli has a long-distance girlfriend. This girlfriend, Kate, who we never actually meet in the movie, moved away 2 years earlier, and because she and Eli are both somewhat dependent, they've chosen not to break up despite the fact that they literally have not seen each other in 2 years. The relationship itself is basically on life support, as Eli is only remaining in it because it's comfortable to be with someone than to be alone, even if that someone isn't actually there. Max is obviously turned off by this discovery, but she feels like there's something there. And the same thing goes for Max and Eli's friends, who all agree that they should set up the two girls together. So over the course of the movie, Max and Eli get more and more comfortable with each other, Max becomes less abrasive, Eli becomes more outgoing and more confident. And while all this is happening, we also get windows into the various lives of all the other lesbian characters, and the various struggles and strifes that they deal with on a daily basis. Whether those struggles be the inherent insecurity of falling into heteronormativity, the possibility of being called a slur while you're walking by, the harsh reality of being rejected by your family after coming out, or the possibility that you will be intensely judged by your peers based on your sexual decisions. Daria. In any case, though, as the film bobs back and forth, we see that Max and Eli are getting pulled closer and closer to each other, until eventually the film climaxes with a climax, as the two women finally sleep together. And this sexual encounter between the two of them is symbolic, as it shows that both of them have finally broken down their boundaries and have become ready to enter in new relationships with each other. And as the film wraps up and heads into the credits, we see a beautiful montage of the two of them going on dates together, as they are now committed girlfriends. And we also get some cutscenes of the sex, which is great. But yeah, that's what happens in Go Fish. And I don't know what to say about this movie in terms of broader criticism. I mean, it's a good movie. It has good performances, especially from a non-professional cast. It has really interesting cinematography. It's very well edited. Like, it's technically a very well-made movie. In a lot of ways, it's better made than Clerks, cinematically. I think the only criticism you can really level against it is the fact that the plot is kind of rudimentary. I mean, the movie's a romantic comedy. We know how things are going to go. But the movie's also smart in the way that it breaks up its narrative with these more experimental pieces, like Max's journal entries or the montages following different characters. Like, those sequences are interesting and surreal enough to keep you invested in what is otherwise a pretty simple story. And that's not to say that the story is bad. It's just something we've seen before, which is fine. But I would also argue that the fact that we've seen this type of movie before really helps with the film's relatability to people outside of its demographic. Because obviously this movie was very explicitly a lesbian film. It was made by lesbians, for lesbians, and about lesbians. And that was literally going through my mind while I was watching this movie for the first time and rewatching it for this review. And when I finally got around to listening to the commentary tracks and watching the cast and crew interviews, this edict was very much confirmed, as Rose Troche very much wanted to make a movie by, for, and about this community. But despite it being a very explicitly lesbian film, I was able to relate to it, because the central character, Max, is basically a bro. Like, seriously, it's interesting. Like, putting aside the fact that Max dresses like a tomboy in the movie, she acts like an immature guy in their early to mid-20s. That's how her character is written. She's shallow, judgmental, mouthy, inconsiderate. She's a spoiled guy. Like, that is very much how a young man in his early 20s behaves. And I know that because I was that. But despite all of Max's bravado and extroverted confidence, she's also incredibly insecure and awkward. Max is also like a hopeless romantic in this movie. She has all these grand ideas and plans regarding what a perfect relationship looks like, how she should live, like what the perfect girlfriend would be for her. But that's all just fantasies in her head brought on by her insecurity. And for so much of the movie, she's just obsessing over the fact that she's been single for a while, and she's not exactly sure why. When in reality, it's because she's immature. The reason she's not in a relationship, despite the fact that she desperately wants to be in one, is because she's not emotionally mature enough to be in one. And the character of Kia says this in the movie, that Max has a lot of growing up to do. That way she's able to get past her petty shallowness and actually accept a good person when that person enters her life. Something else I really like about Max's character in this movie is how, aesthetically speaking, she kind of exists in like an irony bubble. Because if you're looking at conventional beauty standards, Max is the most attractive woman in this movie. But despite being the most conventionally attractive, she's the only lesbian in the movie who's not in a relationship. Even Eli has a relationship at the beginning. It's a long-distance relationship that's basically hanging on a thread, but she's in one. Max, though, isn't. She's not in a relationship, she hasn't gotten laid in almost a year, and all that goes to communicate how it doesn't matter how attractive you are. If you have a bad personality, you have a bad personality. And I think that's interesting in how it plays into Max's character arc in this movie, and how she has to mature and grow, and look past shallow things like looks and style. And I like that this movie highlights that aspect of her character. So personally, despite the fact that this film obviously was not made for me, I was still able to relate to it based on that foundation of character, which I think is something that really helps support the film. The fact that it does have broader appeal despite the demographic it was made for. But I feel like that aspect of the film is also kind of hidden behind the lesbian walls it sets up, because the movie is not subtle. It is very heavy-handed with the themes it's trying to explore and the conversations it wants to have. But still, despite that, you have an interesting character there who has layers, separate from the central ideas of the movie, which once again I find really commendable considering that this movie was made for a very specific demographic, and the director Rose Troche even said herself that she was not at all intending to show how lesbians were just like you. But yeah, Max's character is something I really enjoy about this movie, and another thing I really enjoy about this movie is how realistically awkward her romance with Eli is. Like, Guinevere Turner and V.S. Brody have really good chemistry in this movie, and I like the fact that their characters end up together. But it isn't just smooth charisma throughout the movie as the two inch themselves closer and closer together. Like, there's a lot of awkward conversations, a lot of moments where one person doesn't know the right thing to say, and even when you get to the end of the movie where they're about to hook up with each other, the way they flirt is through Max clipping Eli's nails, which is just a weird thing to do on a date. Even the characters in the movie address that it's a weird thing to do on a date. But that's also just such a realistically awkward thing to do with two people who like each other. And the moment itself stands out so much that they literally made it the cover of the Blu-ray. Which honestly is better than the original DVD cover, which does not convey what this movie's about at all. Of course, something that this Blu-ray and the original DVD cover have in common is the fact that they're both in color when the movie's in black and white, which is just weird. Oh. See? Anyway, I love how awkward their relationship is as it develops, because it feels genuine. Like, it feels like they're two people who are very uncomfortable with each other because they like each other, and they slowly get closer and more comfortable as their relationship progresses, up until the point where they finally sleep together. Moving on from the character stuff, though, there's also a couple key moments in the movie that I'd like to discuss because I find them intellectually interesting just because of how the scenes feel very nuanced in the ideas, even if the presentation itself is not nuanced at all. The first moment in question is right after Max and Eli get back from their first date. You know, it's right before Max sees all of that tea, all of Eli's tea. She's complaining about the movie that they just saw because she's annoyed at the fact that the movie does not represent queer people in a positive way despite being made by a gay filmmaker. Meanwhile, Eli highlights the fact that you shouldn't put so much pressure on one artist to represent an entire community of people because that artist can only tell the story that they know from their perspective. And I find this interaction between Eli and Max to be interesting from a few different perspectives. Because, for one, it shows how the two of them are on completely different maturity levels. and that's communicated through their taste in art. Eli found the film interesting, and she was able to read what the filmmaker's intent was, and how he was sort of expressing self-hatred. Meanwhile, Max sees it as an attack from within her own community. And this distinction between the two women shows how Eli has gotten to a point where she's able to see people as individuals and embrace individual thoughts and ideas that differ from mainstream dogma. Meanwhile, Max still has a collectivistic mindset and views things through a lens of her identity. And obviously this film doesn't take a strict stance on the perspective of whether or not an individual artist has a responsibility to represent an entire demographic of people. Moreover, it just presents the argument for the viewer to engage in themselves, which I enjoy. And if you're asking me what my perspective on the matter is, Eli is clearly the one who's correct in the situation. Like, it's just incredibly unreasonable and ridiculous to ask one person to represent an entire community of people and the conflicting ideas and philosophies existing in that community. An artist can only present the world the way they see it. And if they see the world through a negative lens, then they're going to make art that reflects that lens, because that's their life experience. And you should be allowed to self-criticize from within your own community. If you didn't, then you wouldn't get works of art like The Boondocks, which was made by black people for black people about black people. And I think that series is the prime example of how you can critique your own community from within that community and highlight toxic attributes about that community. So with that all in mind, I really like that discussion between the two characters as it shows polar opposite sides on a single issue. However, something I find a little bit infuriating is the fact that they don't reference what film they're talking about by name. Like, it's really passive-aggressive in a ridiculous way. The fact that, oh, I like the movie, or I dislike the movie. They don't say the movie by name. I mean, they could have just made up a fake name for the movie in the movie. But with that in mind, based on how the scene is written, I suspect that the characters probably were talking about a real film that actually exists in our world, and I don't know which one it was. But, based on what I heard in the commentary tracks in this movie, and the interviews, and what I read in the little booklet that comes with the movie, I imagine that the film that they're talking about in Go Fish is probably either Claire of the Moon or Switch. But those are just guesses on my part. I honestly couldn't tell you. I just find it funny. Of course, going back to the topic of being able to criticize your own community from within the community, this brings me to the other scene I want to talk about in this movie, which is probably the most iconic scene in the movie, being the lesbian trial scene, where Daria is put on trial by a jury of her peers because she's committed the cardinal sin of sleeping with a man. Now, I have discussed this scene before when I was reviewing Chasing Amy, because Kevin Smith took inspiration from this scene in particular when he was writing the pronoun game scene in Chasing Amy. But this scene has always fascinated me ever since the first time I saw this movie, because this scene communicates a central toxic quality of any community or subculture, being the fact that gatekeeping always exists. Whenever you have a group of people who are organizing themselves into a community, there's a hierarchy that naturally emerges because human beings are just stupid. And when labels get involved, people tie their identity to a specific label, being like, I'm this and I'm that. And if you step outside what's expected of that label, it's treated as a betrayal to the community. Almost as if you're committing an act of blasphemy against your own community and are therefore getting excommunicated from that community. And I love this scene a lot. It illustrates how when you belong to a community, any community, that community always has a dark side, and that community always has people at the top making rules about what you can and can't do when you're just a person living your life. And obviously there's lines in life you shouldn't cross, there's things that you shouldn't do because of how they affect others. But when it comes to labels and how you identify yourself, no one has the right to tell you you are or are not something simply based on a list of arbitrary rules that they just decided on. It's stupid, it's toxic, and you don't need that as an individual. And I love the fact that this scene exists, that Rose Troche had the guts to put it in, despite the fact that so many people were telling her that she shouldn't, because it illustrates how everything has a dark side. Of course, that being said, something I learned while listening to one of the commentary tracks for this movie is that apparently this entire trial sequence is not real. It's like a fantasy dream sequence that's inside the mind of the character Daria. Because Daria in this movie is very promiscuous. Like, one of the running jokes in the movie is that she has a new girlfriend in every scene. So her sleeping around and eventually sleeping with a man and then getting judged for it is meant to be a representation of her own insecurity regarding how she's living her life. But here's the thing. Even though Rose Troche says that this scene is supposed to be imaginary, I don't know if it is. Because on the one hand, it would make sense if this scene was fake. I mean, how do the women in the trial know that Daria slept with a man? Were they stalking her? Did they look through the window while she was doing it? Like, how did they know that she did that? Because Daria wouldn't be a person to brag about that, especially since she says in the trial scene that she wouldn't tell a woman that she was going to take home that she had just slept with a man. So it would make sense if this was a dream sequence simply based on how that would work. But also according to Rose Troche, this scene was based on a Disney cartoon that she saw as a kid called Pluto's Judgment Day, where Pluto gets put on trial by a bunch of ghost cats because he keeps on being a dick to cats. And it's revealed at the end of that cartoon that the whole trial that Pluto was on was just a dream. It was a nightmare that he was having. Because Mickey scolded him for being a dick to cats. Which is ironic because Mickey's a mouse and cats eat mice and whatever. It's a good cartoon, and oddly enough, the cartoon also reminds me of Heavenly Puss, which is a Tom and Jerry cartoon where Tom needs to get Jerry to forgive him, otherwise he's going to hell. And also All Dogs Go to Heaven Too, when the cat devil is trying to get all the dogs to get dragged down to, like, kennel hell. A lot of animal hell stuff. It's interesting. But that Mickey Mouse cartoon was the central inspiration for this sequence. So, considering it's a dream there, I don't find it hard to believe that it would also be a dream here. Which is also funny that there's a chain of inspiration there. You know, that cartoon inspired Go Fish inspired Chasing Amy, and it's interesting. So yeah, like, I could see how this is an imagined dream sequence, especially since it's very surreal, much like many of Max's journal entry fantasies in the movie. But also, I don't know if Rose Troche is telling the truth, because she admits herself that multiple people attached to this movie kept telling her not to shoot the scene, and many of the actresses in that trial scene were telling her that they'd leave the project if she kept it in. She had to convince them to do it. So I feel like her saying that this scene is imaginary could be her trying to save face, especially since she co-wrote this movie with Guinevere Turner. And obviously the two of them, wrote different scenes and sequences separately. I don't know how much overlap there was, but, like, it's entirely possible that Guinevere Turner has a different perspective of this scene than Rose Troche does. And also the way it's played in the film. It doesn't feel like the other fantasy sequences. Like, it's surreal, but it feels like, Daria, she gets picked up off the streets and then taken to, like, a mysterious building and put on trial. Like, it's a ridiculous scene, it's surreal, but it also is played straight, in a way. Like, I don't know. It feels like the scene could be real, even though it's apparently fake. I don't know. In any case, I just like the scene. I like the fact that it's there. It's interesting, it communicates a lot of interesting ideas. But yeah, there's so many other great things about this movie that I really enjoy, like the overall tone. It's a very playful film, but it's also very cozy at the same time. It's comfortable. Like I said earlier, I also really love the editing in this movie, especially the sex scene where they keep intercutting with cooking shots of Eli cooking. I also like how this film employs the female gaze and focuses on aspects of the female body that typically aren't focused on in movies that employ the male gaze. It's interesting and also helps set the film apart visually, because instead of just focusing on TNA, you're focusing on the overall beauty of the feminine form. And that also gets into how this movie treats sex. Sex is treated as a passionate act in this movie. The women in this movie enjoy sex, they seek it out, but they're not obsessed with it. It's treated like a casual aspect of everyday life. And that casual nature is also probably the best thing about Go Fish. The fact that this is a movie where people are allowed to exist. It's not a coming out movie the way so many other queer stories are, where it's like, it's building up to you confronting your family about who you are really deep inside. And it's not like a downer queer movie where, like, someone dies of AIDS or kills themselves or something, despite the fact that that is what Rose Troche actually wanted to do, and she was talked out of it. It's just a movie about a group of women living their lives and trying to find love in the process. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we're all trying to do? Just live our lives and find someone to love us? As cliche as that sounds. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. Go Fish is funny, charming, and most importantly, it's authentic. And that authenticity is what really set the tone for queer movies moving forward. So despite the fact that it's obscure, I think Go Fish does have a legacy that's been cemented in this generation of the mid-90s. And I think the fact that it has such an optimistic and hopeful ending, showing Max and Eli living happily ever after, can be inspiration for all of us. That if we just grow up a little bit, we can find someone who will truly love us despite our faults. But in any case, that was my review of Go Fish. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram and Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. I hope you all had a very happy Pride Month and found a lesbian that loves you very, very, very much. And I will see you later.